Welcome to episode 66 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the Epicurean forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. For anyone who's not familiar with our podcast, please check back to episode 1 for a discussion of our goals and ground rules. If you have any question about those, please be sure to contact us at epicureanfriends.com for more information. In this episode 66, we'll continue our discussion of Book 5 at approximately Latin line 91. Now let's join Don reading today's text.
And what remains but now, as the order of my design requires, to convince by proper reasons that this world is formed of mortal seeds, that it began to be and must have an end, and to show how the seeds of matter were united and disposed to produce the earth, the heavens, the sea, the stars, the sun and moon, and then what creatures sprung from earth and what never had a being, and how the human race with various language began to give names to things and to converse together, and by what means that dread of deities above first crept into the heart, which preserves the holy things throughout the world, the temples, the lakes, groves, altars, and images of the gods. Besides, I shall explain the course of the sun and moon, and by what overruling force nature directs their motions, lest you should suppose these luminaries travel their constant stages freely and of their own accord between heaven and earth, and by their kind influence promote the growth of fruits and the whole animal creation, or conceive that they are rolled about by the will of the gods. For those who well know that the gods live a life of ease, if they should wonder by what power the world is carried on, especially in the things they see over their heads in the heavens above, they relapse again into their old superstition. They raise over themselves a set of cruel tyrants who the wretches fancy can do all things, because they know nothing of what can or what cannot be, or by what means a finite power is fixed to every being, and a boundary immovable which it cannot pass. And therefore, to keep you no longer in suspense in what I promised, take a view in the first place of the seas, the earth, and the heavens. This triple nature, these 3 bodies, my Memmius, these beings of so different a frame, 3 so wonderfully formed, one day shall put an end to. And the whole mass and fabric of the world that has stood for many ages shall tumble to pieces. I know how this future ruin of heaven and earth seems strange and surprising to your apprehensions, and how difficult it is to convince you of the truth of it. This is a common case, which you offer a subject to the ear it has been unused to, and which you cannot discover with your eyes, nor feel with your hands, the ways by which knowledge and belief generally find a passage to the breast and affect the mind. I'll go on, however. The very nature of the things perhaps will give a credit to my words, and you may soon see the whole fabric of the world shaken grievously by terrible convulsions, but the commanding power of chance remove that day far from us. And let reason, rather than the thing itself, convince us that all things dissolved by the last dreadful crack will fall to ruin. But before I attempt to teach these truths, more sacred and much more worthy of belief than what the Pythonist delivers from the tripod and laurel of Apollo, I shall first offer some encouragements against your fears, lest, being under the check of religion, you should by chance imagine that the earth, the sun, the heavens, the sea, the stars, the moon, being animated by a spirit diffused throughout the whole, were a deity, and would remain forever, and consequently that all those deserve justly the same punishment as the rebel giants for their impiety, who by their arguments should assault and break down the walls of the world, and would extinguish the sun, the bright luminary of the sky, and pronounce a sentence of dissolution upon things in their own nature immortal. And yet these things are so far from having anything of divinity about them, and so unworthy of being ranked in the number of the gods, that they may be thought rather to give us a notion of something as remote from sense and vital motion as possible. For we are not to imagine that the powers, mind, and soul can be united with all sorts of bodies, as there are no trees in the sky, no clouds can be in the deep sea, nor can fish live in the fields, nor can there be blood in wood or moisture in stones. The soul therefore cannot come into being alone without the body, nor can she exist separately without the nerves and the blood. If this could be, the powers of the soul you would feel sometimes in the head or shoulders, or even in the very bottom of the feet, or in any part of the body, and so you would perceive it diffusing itself through the whole body. as water poured into a vessel first covers one part and then spreads over the whole. Since therefore there is a proper and determinate place in the body for the mind and soul to be and increase in, we have the more reason to deny that they can continue or be born without it, or that the form of life can reside in rotten clods of earth, or in the fire of the sun, or in the water, or in the lofty regions of the sky. These therefore are so far from being endued with a divine understanding that they are incapable even of being animated with common life.
Thank you, Don, for reading that. And that was very well read for your first endeavor with us in the podcast. So again, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
A lot in this section, and we've traditionally gone paragraph by paragraph, but does anybody have any particular place they'd like to start? Hearing nothing, let's just take the first paragraph. Just in general, though, as I'm listening to you read that, Don, this, to my mind, summarizes some of the deepest parts of what Epicurean philosophy is all about in its assessment of the nature of the universe being natural and not supernatural. Sometimes I think you could just put the whole ethics aside, and this is just obviously so key to them that they reach these conclusions that the soul does not last after death and that there's no supernatural beings creating the universe. So at least in these passages, I think he's hitting that home pretty hard.
Yeah, and I think it's it gives a nice scheme of an outline to the whole structure of the poem too. I mean, he starts out with, the world formed by mortal seeds, what began to be, what has an end, and all those sorts of things. And he's just laying out where he's going to go and where he's been.
Right, right.
I did find it interesting that whenever he talks about the dread of deities, that he talks about it coming into the breast. Where is that line? Yeah, where the dread of deities above crept into the heart. And I think it's interesting that he uses the word pectora in the Latin, and that's where, the heart, the breast, and that's where the Epicureans saw the seat of the intellect or the animus or whatever it is. So it was that center of the chest that, it felt that you feel emotions. And I thought it was kind of interesting that it actually used that metaphor of, creeping into the heart, and that's where it's located.
Yeah, and I kind of think what you're talking about too is he's sort of relating it to the images aspect of things as opposed to the observation through the five senses. Is that part of what you're thinking about? Or
I think so. And I think the phrase itself, the dread of deities, I looked at, and it has to do with the Latin has the sense of dread, awe, fear, anxiety, apprehension. Mm-hmm. All those sorts of things come into that. If you are looking at the nature of the supernatural deities, they're gonna give you all kinds of problems.
Right. Which of the passages, which paragraphs of what we have before us today are you looking at?
I believe it. I don't have the line number, but it is the dread deities. Let me grab that. And by what means that dread of deities above first crept into the heart, which preserves the holy things throughout the world.
Yes. Okay. I think when I made my comment about the images, I think maybe the word that was interesting me there was the crept into the heart, mm-hmm. Almost as if they crept without our conscious activity in assessing it, almost as if it was a natural thing, maybe. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that is in the first sentence here, in the first paragraph here. And there's so many times when you continue the sentence that you were just reading, I wonder if, and I don't want to put too much emphasis on the way it's translated or the precise words, but I sometimes wonder whether he's being sarcastic, because the next passage talks about preserves the holy things throughout the world. And so he starts listing the temples, the lakes, the groves, the altars, and the images of the gods. Is that just a statement of fact? Is it a statement of, when he calls them holy, is it sarcastic?
I don't think it's sarcastic. I get the sense that he's talking about that some people who, and he even talks about it later on, some people who get the idea that they understand that, the gods are, incorruptible and blessed beings, but they backslide when they start to think about the way that the planets and the sun and the moon and the stars go about their motions in the sky, that they sometimes understand that, I realize the gods are like this, but these individual beings, these planets and stars, actually have their own actions in the heavens that are their own divine motions. And I think that what he's saying is that the dread of deities above first crept into the heart, which preserves the holy things throughout the world, and that dread, that awe, that anxiety about the deities is what makes people set things apart, like temples and lakes and groves and altars.
Right. Again, it may be that this translation or the precise wording that we're reading in English is not exactly what was on Lucretius's mind, but at least in the way it's worded here, he's actually saying that it's the dread of the deities, which of course would be improper under Epicurean philosophy. You should not be dreading the deities. So he's saying that it's the dread of the deities that preserves the holy things throughout the world, as if a proper Epicurean approach to the gods would not have resulted in these altars, groves, lakes, and temples. So
exactly. Yeah, I would concur with that.
Mm-hmm. And of course, in the next passage from what you're reading, where he talks about, lest you suppose that the luminaries travel their stages freely and of their own accord between heaven and earth. Again, I don't have the knowledge of Socrates and Plato and the prior guys, but I seem to read in the commentators that these other philosophers held that the stars and planets were actually gods themselves.
Right. I seem to remember, don't believe I wrote it down, but I seem to remember that some of this has to do with the Timaeus, with Plato's the Timaeus, and that's the, sort of the idea that he put forth in that particular text. And Epicurus responded directly to the Timaeus, and in a specific book, I can't remember which book of On Nature they say that was in, and then Lucretius used that as a text for his poem going back to Epicurus. Mm-hmm. But I think it's interesting because he says that you can't believe that the planets are gods and have their own actions, that they're not gods, and further that they don't have any life force themselves. Like he talks about the soul not being able to exist in the fire of the sun and clods of the earth and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And my eye is caught by what you cited previously about relapsing again into their old superstition. It's possible that because we talk about this every week on Lucretius, and it's possible to maybe overlook one of the most basic aspects of it, which is that it is this misunderstanding or error about the nature of the universe, which amounts to ignorance of the way things are, that leads people to have these fears and leads to the whole system of supernatural religion and setting up a cruel tyrant who we fancy can do all things. And so it's really reminding me of just the educational focus of Epicurean philosophy. It's not here's your list of 10 commandments to do and not do in your ethical life. It starts out with an explanation of the way the world works, from which we will then come up with our best way of living.
Exactly. And consider that the first line of the Tetrapharmakos is, don't fear the gods.
Right.
And don't backslide.
Again, I may be putting too much weight on the English translation of this, but something else that catches my eye, who the wretches fancy can do all things. Now, that sounds a little bit more like a more modern reference to an omnipotent God, maybe, than I sometimes think the Greeks had about Zeus, because it seems to me that their concepts of the gods were significantly more limited. I don't know whether this is a reference to a wider view of a god than the Greeks had, but
it could very well be. I mean, I think we've talked in the past about you have talked in the past about the idea of the universe being infinite. But then I believe it was Martin who even said that, if the universe may not be, infinite literally, but as far as from the relative stance of human beings, it might as well be infinite. And I think the gods could be looked at the same way that, Jupiter may not be, infinitely powerful, but he's going to be infinitely powerful relative to human beings.
Martin, let's bring you back into the discussion.
Yeah, actually, I had an idea, but now I lost it. No. The one thing is that I'm not sure how well Epicurus knew about Jewish beliefs, and at the time of Lucretius, the Romans certainly knew about Jewish beliefs, and Epicurus might not have that knowledge. And my understanding is that the ancient Jewish God was already omnipotent. So that means that was already a God like the Christian God. And that means that here Lucretius may have known a bit more than Epicurus.
That's a good point about that time sequence, because certainly Diogenes of Oinoander mentions the Jews on his wall, and certainly you're right that the Romans knew them, but as far as when Epicurus was writing, they might not have had quite the same interplay. I interrupted you, Don. I think, what were you going to say?
Oh, no. I was just agreeing. Yeah.
Okay.
To sort of flow into the next part of the section that we read, I found it interesting where he talks about the triple nature, the three bodies, the three so wonderfully formed, the seas, the earth, and the heaven. That whole idea of three bodies or three natures just seems so reminiscent of so many different threes in both mythology and religion, with the Christian Trinity and the Buddhist three jewels, and the three fates, and Osiris, Horus, and Isis in Egyptian mythology. I just found that fact that he uses the number three there three times, basically, the triple nature, three bodies, three so wonderfully formed, that has too many parallels just to be by chance.
I agree that you're right. And I wonder what his intent was, if it had a significance to the Epicureans as well as the people you're talking about.
Yeah, I wonder if he used that as a physical manifestation of the triple nature, three bodies sorts of thing, where it's a natural division where you have the seas, the earth, and then the heavens.
Yeah.
And the Latin word for the heavens is literally the vault of heaven. So everything that's in the sky, and which would include the planets and the sun and the moon and all that.
Okay, and that's when he has shifted the discussion to begin to talk about how these three separate natures, as wonderful as they are, will eventually come to an end.
Correct. And one of the things that I found interesting there, I originally thought, well, if everything's going to come to an end, how can you talk about the infinite existence of the universe and that it existed eternally? And so I don't believe he's talking about the cosmos as a whole. I think he's talking about just our particular manifestation of it.
Yeah.
Exactly. This is sometimes then called cosmos as a local cosmos, as compared to the universe, which encompasses all the cosmos.
Exactly. That's how I see it. And that our local cosmos is basically like a human being or any other thing that's created out of atoms and void, that it comes together, you exist for a while, and then you dissolve, and then you're made into something else to reuse the atoms that you already had.
You know, the way you said that leads right into what I was about to say next, Don, because while you were talking, I looked back at that list of what I understand to be the 12 fundamentals of nature that Epicurus has suggested. And I don't see among them a statement that everything that comes together from atoms eventually breaks down into those atoms again. But I think that is implicit in Epicurean philosophy, and it would hold true for everything except, like you said, the universe as a whole, and then presumably Epicurean gods, if you start going down that road of talking about them. But I'm kind of treating that, and I think it's correct to treat this principle that everything that comes together eventually splits apart as a foundational physical premise. Do y'all agree with that?
Yeah, and the only thing, I mean, it says the only thing that exists are atoms and void. So the universe itself is atoms and void, and the individual agglomerations of atoms in any particular place are just temporary constructions that are eventually going to die and break down.
Okay, now, you know, the way you say that, we could really go off into a rabbit trail of discussing what the word exists means. Because certainly, Don, I consider that you exist, even though you are composed of atoms and voids. So it has multiple meanings there.
Yep.
But I don't remember, I was trying to think if I can remember an explicit statement in Lucretius or in Herodotus that everything that comes together eventually breaks apart. But I guess maybe it's not explicit in one single sentence like I'm trying to remember, but it certainly is pretty implicit in many of the discussions. And I guess it's implicit in this discussion right here. That's what he's saying about all of this that we see will eventually tumble to pieces.
And I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, because I believe that it does. There is a section coming up in Book 5 that I have noted in my Stallings translation around line 350, 360 that talks about things that are eternal and that kind of stuff. So I will hold off on that, but I have a lot of marginalia in that section of my translation, so we'll save that for then.
Yeah. I mean, there's an awful lot of discussion when he talks about the soul or the spirit. There's an awful lot of commentary about how it cannot remain united with the body for an eternal amount of time. And I think that argument is premised on the fact that pretty much all bodies don't remain united among themselves for an eternal amount of time. You know, you said the only thing that exists is atom and void. Is there a statement that only matter is eternal? Only the elements are eternal? Aren't there statements to that effect?
It's not even element. It's the seed. It's the atoms themselves. It's the seeds themselves that
okay,
are
well,
the
that's
only
what
thing
I
that
meant.
exists. Yeah.
Yeah, but maybe if we went back into that background discussion of the nature of the seeds or the atoms or the elemental particles, that we would find him saying that only those at that level are eternal and unchangeable, but that everything else therefore is.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. Like I said, around line 350. So that'll be a few sessions yet, but that have Stallings here just very, very quickly. Is her translation is, besides there are three types of things that last forever, and then she lists atoms are one, the void is another, and the universe, the sum totality, will last forever, since there is no other place beyond and past the universe for things to leap to, or place whence there could come. So
okay, well, that's exactly the point then. Yeah. And do you have a page or a chapter verse reference to that?
That's book 5, line around 350, 360. So okay, that will be so that's a foreshadowing. Stay tuned, listeners.
Yeah. Sounds like 3 or 4 at least episodes away.
Exactly. If
we go at about 100 lines an episode.
Yep. And so I think the next section that really struck me was the whole thing about the mind and soul not being able to exist without a body. And that seems to be what he drives home towards the last part of the section that we read today.
And he's saying that certainly the mind and the soul cannot remain forever united with the body, and for that reason, even stronger, these bodies cannot be gods.
Right, because you can't have a mind or a soul without a thinking body and earth and the fire of the sun and all those sorts of things. There is nothing for a soul to attach itself to, or that's not the right way to say it, but there is no soul or animating life force in something like a physical thing like the sun or the moon or clods of earth.
And the premise there being is that gods are souls or animated forces or intelligent beings themselves.
Right. And I found it interesting too. You even mentioned, I believe, the difficulty of trying to wrap your brain around the anima and the animus.
The difference between soul and spirit.
Exactly.
Or intelligence or consciousness or whatever word you want to use.
Exactly. It covers so wide of an area. The only thing I could try, and I literally tried to go through and figure out where he used which words where, and it looks like, so in line 126, he uses the animus and the concilium. Those are two, that's the mind and understanding. And then in lines 132 and 134, he uses the animus. In 140, he then brings in the anima and the animus. And in line 145, then he talks about to breathe life into things. He uses the word, the verb animata. So to actually breathe life into something. And what I could try and wrap my brain around was that the anima is, it's a feminine noun. The root meaning of it is the breath or the air or the life force of something that animates something, whereas the animus is masculine and has the idea of reason and mind and intellect. So those two things have to exist together. And I found it interesting because the one place that he uses the pronoun she whenever he's talking about the life force towards the end here. And so that would be the feminine principle of the breath and the air and the life, the animating principle of the body. The soul, therefore, cannot come into being alone without the body, nor can she exist separately without the nerves and the blood. So he's talking about she there as the animating life force that makes a body actually live.
You know, the closer we get to discussing some very practical aspect of the body and the way we function and so forth, I certainly see how it's useful to break down these different distinctions. But I wonder philosophically, or at the sort of the highest level that Epicurus is looking at things, do you see a distinction, Don, that's important philosophically?
That's a very good question. I think one of the problems, too, is with Lucretius writing in Latin and Epicurus writing in Greek, because I've seen that the psyche in Greek can actually cover both of the ideas of both the reason and the intellect and the animating life force, and that there may be a distinction between how the Greeks describe something and how the Romans describe something. So we have that difficulty to wade through as well.
And is there a distinction about where they came from or the significance of them in some way that's really important for the basic thrust of Epicurean philosophy in terms of being natural versus supernatural? Or is there, I'm trying to always keep in mind as we discuss the different concepts, what the purpose of them, of identifying them really is. Martin, do you have any comment on that part of things? Do you see a distinction that's important between animus, anima, soul, spirit, mind, intellect? And when I say important, obviously, the more practical you really want to get about describing things to somebody, the more detailed you're going to want to be and use words like that. But philosophically speaking, from a very 50,000-foot level, is there an important distinction between those things at the very highest level? Or are we simply talking about human life versus gods versus inanimate matter?
I think you have to think, too, about looking at a human being, and there is a human being who is alive, and then there's a human being who's dead. And you have to, at some point it's, obvious, but, whenever there is a process going on, if someone's dying, or what is it that animates that person? And I think that's what they're trying to get at. There is a distinction between being alive and dead, but, what is that distinction? What gives life to something as opposed to a rock or a stone or the sun? And I think that's what they're trying to get at is, what does it mean to be alive?
Yeah. Martin?
Yeah, I didn't really have a comment on this one. It may actually be quite fundamental. At least in some religions, it's very fundamental.
And that's why it almost seems like some religions do feel it necessary to provide the idea of the soul, because they look at, somebody who is alive and somebody who is dead, and what's the difference? So, well, there must have been something that was there that's not there anymore, and you don't want to accept the fact that it doesn't exist anymore, but it's something that there is some sort of principle, some sort of thing that makes you alive versus makes you dead. And I think it's a hard thing to grapple with. And one of the things that's so difficult about Epicurus' philosophy is that there's nothing that exists after you're dead. Everything is bound together with your soul, your spirit, your mind, your physical being, all clamp onto each other. And whenever those atoms go away, that goes away too.
Yeah. What you've just done there is, I think, what I see him doing is, I think all this discussion of soul, mind, intellect, and the different subdivisions have importance, but at the most fundamental level, I think you're right that he's looking for something very basic, such as an animating principle or some method of distinguishing the person who's alive from the body that is now dead. And I tend to think that much of the philosophy is really gauged at that level. And this is the part that would be the rabbit hole to pursue very far, but I kind of think the same thing goes on with something like pain and pleasure. We talk about the division, and we've been talking about it lately, Don, some of the material out there about the difference between emotions and feelings and so forth. And I certainly think it's important to drill down and get the shades of meaning and divide up all those things that we're talking about. But sometimes I do think that Epicurus is really starting at a very fundamental level, and that he's really not concerned sometimes to be talking about the different types of pain or the different types of pleasure. Certainly, at some point, there's definite discussion about dividing up mental pain and pleasure from bodily pain and pleasure. There's a specific reference in Cicero's own end that divides that up. But I do think that there's a sort of a hierarchy of the way he approaches things, so that when he talks about pain and pleasure, it's almost like he's talking about life or the anima that you're talking about right now, or the spirit. He's summarizing to an extremely high level his fundamental point. And yes, he'll come back to that later, or yes, he wants to expand that in greater detail as you go along. But that in this sort of hierarchical outline of looking at life that Epicurus seems to be emphasizing, as he does in the letter to Herodotus, that you need this outline, you need these fundamental principles that you're going to refer to every day, and not necessarily every detail that you don't refer to every day. I just see a parallel there sometime in a lot of things. So here, talking about mind and soul and spirit and intellect, and I would suggest maybe there's the same thing going on with pain and pleasure, and maybe things like the gods as well. In every aspect of the philosophy, it seems like there's sort of a telescoping level of analysis going on.
I would agree. I mean, I keep coming back to the canon with the, you have the sensations, you have the prolepses, and you have the pathe, the feelings that are two. You have pain, you have pleasure. And you have on, you have off, you have attract, you have repel. And I think that it starts out at a very basic fundamental level that you have that.
You have atoms, you have void. You have you have basic distinctions between things that are sort of a starting point and a touchstone of the analysis everywhere you go through.
And that's one of the things that I hesitate to bring up, Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, like I've done in the forum, but I think it's so interesting the way that she starts out at that fundamental level with pleasure and displeasure and the level of arousal. And that's the thing that everything else is built on, is your body budget and all that sort of thing. But the fact that it's, pleasure, she calls it pleasure and displeasure, I believe, but it's pleasure and it's pain, and it's the amount of arousal that you have within that spectrum there between those two things that starts out the cascade of everything else. And I think it's the same way with Epicurus.
Now, you've used the word arousal there. I probably have used the word intensity or something like that. Yep. But that's the deal. Whenever you add anything to the categories there are two, pain and pleasure, the next modifier that you add to it is the beginning of that slope, which is good, and it has to be there. You have to make that analysis. But I guess anytime there's a third quality to it, then there's a lot more to discuss. Everybody pretty much understands pain and pleasure, but even the issue of and am I correct in analogizing intensity to arousal, or is it more like focus?
That's my understanding. It's the difference. It's a difference between, if we're taking pain, it's the difference between a pinprick and getting your arm cut off.
So just some measure of significance.
Exactly. Yeah. That's a very good way to put it. Yeah.
Which everybody who comes to Epicurean philosophy says, well, that doesn't help me very much. You're telling me to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. Okay, well, give me some specifics about what you're supposed to do. Well, then, yes, I'm giving you more specific. Don't just go for pleasure and avoid pain. Go for the most significant pleasure and avoid the most significant pain. Now, that answers all your questions, doesn't it? and of course, it doesn't.
And close scene.
Yeah, in closing, that's all you need to know. Thank you for coming and joining us today. We've told you, avoid pain, pursue pleasure, and go for the most significant of each. That's all you need to know.
And that's a wrap.
So, yeah, that's right.
At the end of the passage that we read today just seems to hammer home the fact that the rotten clods of earth, the fire of the sun, water, the sky, you cannot imbue these things as either a deity or having a life in and of themselves. They are physical entities created by matter and void, and they have their own laws of motion that they are following, and they have no supernatural being in and of themselves, and don't consider them gods.
Right. Now, the point I would like to emphasize there would be to take us back to the sort of canonical issues that we debate regularly, and to observe the way he's phrasing this argument. His argument is, as there are no trees in the sky, no clouds can be in the deep sea, nor fish can live in the fields, nor can there be blood and wood or moisture and stones, therefore these things are going to take place. So he is reasoning from the observable to create a rule that he is then applying and saying, therefore you can conclude with confidence something else. And that's the tricky aspect of it that we've discussed numerous times and probably will always discuss back and forth, is the conversion of a certain number of observations to a rule.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things I keep meaning to read and I apologize for the title. I can't remember the work of Philodemus that talks about
on methods of inference is the way it's titled today. It's a very interesting issue of how you, we're focused on the senses, we're focused on observation above all, but I do think this is an example of what he is expecting you to do with that observation. He's expecting you to be able to reach a conclusion and then apply that conclusion in those areas where you find it to have good reason. I don't want to use rational and reason there. I want to say something else, but there's obviously some kind of intelligent process of weighing going on about when you have enough information and when you don't, because somebody can easily say, well, you haven't seen any fish living in your fields, but you need to come visit my fields because I've got them crawling all over the place. And I'll show you some stones that you can cut, and in the middle there's a bunch of water in it. And you say there's no clouds in the sea. You just haven't been to my sea yet. And those issues are real, I think. But at least in terms of tracing what Epicurus and the Epicureans were doing, they did not reach the conclusion that there's nothing but observation. They believed there was a valid way of reaching conclusions based on observation.
Right. Because it comes down to it that there is nothing else. I mean, you observe things through your senses, and that's the way you get information about the physical universe composed of atoms and void. And what else do you have? I mean, you can make up ideal forms like Plato did and those kinds of things, but it's completely divorced from quote unquote reality.
Yeah. And all of this argument is based on observation. None of it's based on, remember that Epicurus said, or remember that the goddess Athena said or did or something. It's all just something that's really directly observable by basically every human being who's got a normal level of eyesight and ability to observe things.
And that dovetails back into what we were talking about with the worship / respect of Epicurus, that you don't necessarily take what he said as dogma,
right?
But he's the one who pointed out to begin with, here's the things you can do and here's the observations you can make, and you can respect him for bringing that to the fore. So
there's none of that in here that it's true because Epicurus said it was true. It's all a statement and a presentation of the evidence combined with an expectation that you're going to use that evidence in a particular way.
Right.
Martin.
Yes, listening.
I would be curious to get Martin's take on the faculty of observation and how important observation is, especially as it compares to what Lucretius is talking about as opposed to modern science, and if there are both analogies and differences.
Yeah, I mean, the observations are certainly analogous to what we do in science, at least in experimental science. No? So that we just, in experimental science, it's just done systematically and with a protocol, but basically it's just very similar to like any person makes observations.
And do you think that's what Epicurus was talking about, the systematic observations and then applying those observations? Is that the kind of thing that he discussed?
Certainly. I mean, it's one of the major criteria of truth to the observations. No?
Yeah, I think that I think you put that a good way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was all what I would have to say on that at the moment.
Yeah. I don't know if this makes any difference in the way of thinking about it, but I guess as I'm looking at that last passage, he starts out by talking about the things that you do see, and then he also adds to the argument the observation of things that you don't see. If this could be, then the powers of the soul would feel sometimes in the head or shoulders, at the bottom of your feet, or in any other part of your body, and you would perceive it diffusing itself through the body. So he also combines in his argument, I don't know what you call that. I don't know whether that's some kind of negation or not, but of course you've got the cliche that the absence of evidence is the evidence of absence is not the absence of evidence, or how does that cliche work?
I think it's the other way around. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Evidence of absence, yes.
So you can't prove a negative.
Right. That kind of those kind of logical observations. You can't prove a negative. How do you unwrap that? Obviously, the absence. How do you say the cliche again? The evidence of absence is not.
The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So if you say that there are no pink elephants, you've just never seen a pink elephant.
How do we unwrap that, though? Is that cliche valid from what part of it is valid and what part of it is invalid? Because obviously, if I'm looking out my window and I don't see any pink elephants, That is not proof that there are no pink elephants anywhere, but it's a pretty good start to the observation that pink elephants aren't everywhere. Is there a way in which that cliche is partly valid and partly invalid, or that it has to be limited?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it has to do with repeated observations and that sort of thing.
Because repeated observations of nothing is some evidence. I mean, now I'm coming at it from my legal point of view. It may not be conclusive evidence for you to decide to base your life on it or something like that, but it is some evidence.
And at least it seems to me that the more observations you have, the higher probability that that particular thing does not exist. You can't say for certain, and I think that's where science comes in too, that science will say, there's a high probability that there are not pink elephants, but we are not going to rule out the fact that there may be an observation of a pink elephant somewhere.
Right.
But until we see one, we're going to say, we're pretty sure there's not any.
We're going to be skeptical towards it for sure. Martin, you have any comment on that cliche about absence of evidence?
Yeah, I mean, in some way it's true. I mean, if we just do one or a few observations, we cannot really conclude much of that. But on the other hand, if a lot of observations are done and it's never found, and somehow these observations are made under quite a wide array of different conditions, then we will then empirically somehow state that it hasn't been observed. So we can then from there do something like, I mean, it's not really a logical conclusion, but it's something like it doesn't happen. Huh?
Martin, are you familiar with that cliche? Is that something that in German is a current cliche?
Yeah, I mean, in this particular formulation, I didn't know it, but it's certainly part of, how to say this, I mean, I cannot trace it back where I had this in the study. So I definitely didn't have it in this form, but in a different way, I certainly encountered this many times.
Well, certain things kind of enter into the common discussion of, out there in the world today and in America in 2021. And that's it's obviously not a cliche you hear every day, but it's certainly one that has worked its way into sort of common parlance. And now that we think about it, I think it's interesting to consider to what extent it's valid and to what extent it's invalid, or how do you understand it in context to make the most sense out of it. Some cliches are better than others.
Well put.
All right. That probably is enough on that cliche. Let's begin to talk about closing comments for today, and we'll begin to bring things to a conclusion. And in our past practice, we've generally gone to Martin to see if he had any closing comments first and then gone around the table. But we can start with that, and maybe Don will say something that brings up another comment from Martin. But Martin, do you have any closing comments for today?
No, like most of the time, no.
Okay. Well, I bet Don has some closing comments.
I think I'm good for today because we've really seemed to bring out some interesting topics in the sections that we read, and I'm looking forward to hitting some more in the next section as well.
Yeah, this has been a good set of passages for today. And once again, we've been down from our quota of 4 panelists. I think Charles is still on vacation, but should be back with us next week. So in the next episode, we should be back up to full strength. Okay, well, with that, I don't think I have anything to add for today. So we'll just break and come back in about a week. So thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.